Last time, we talked about Thomas More's Utopia and part one. And we talked about how part one was actually what he wrote second. The part two is what he originally wrote when he had a little downtime on a diplomatic mission in the Netherlands somewhere, maybe Belgium, I don't really remember. He just did it as sort of a lark, a little intellectual exercise to entertain his friends. But because he was already an intellect of some considerable heft, he had immediate plans for publishing it. But when he got back to London, he started looking at it and realizing, some of this can get me into hot water. So let me take a little bit of extra time and I'll write sort of a preface to it that just couches it a little and makes it clear to everybody that I am not necessarily advocating some of this stuff that I seem to be clearly advocating for in part two. The bulk of that part one was the frame tale, as it's called, where he sets up part two through a little story where he bumps into this intrepid explorer who is just back from the New World, which in the early 16th century was very new indeed to Europeans, and was coming back with fantastical tales of this great civilization just over there, out of the scope of European corruption. And that part one is constructed very deliberately to give him a little plausible deniability, a little distance from what he had written before. He was in the process of backing into a job working for King Henry, and he was having a little trouble with it. He didn't want to, he didn't want to sell out to the man, and was afraid of losing his independence, and didn't want to be just another corporate suck-up in the royal court. So part one is largely an argument about that, about intellectual independence on the part of the wild man Raphael Hythloday, and why he does not want to go into service of some royal somewhere. They don't mention Henry by name, but he is clearly a possibility. But the conversation that develops through part one is then about the figure of More, Thomas More, who writes himself into this story, sort of debating this character, Hythloday. And More is much more pragmatic and saying, come on, it's a good job, you'll be able to do good with people, you'll be able to affect good, positive change in society with all of your experience and everything that you've seen and that you claim to have such strong opinions of. And Hythloday begging off and saying, no, I would have to compromise, my integrity is too strong for that, I could never do that, I won't be sullied by those dirty, money-grubbing bastards in the royal court. So that's how part one plays out. But in the process, we are given, as readers, we are given this very strong debate, which in fairness I think is closer to my instinct is to say is that it is closer to the actual personality and mental makeup of the author, Thomas More, than the second part. He was a lawyer by training, by birth, by temperament. Everything in that opening part is about debating different sides of an argument and looking at it. And when Hythloday comes out with one argument, the character of More comes out with something else and counters it. And there are other characters, another lawyer, the archbishop, who raise different points, and he is triangulating around this idea of somewhere within that there is perhaps a rational truth to get at, but the only way to get at it is through this kind of intellectual debate, this kind of rigor. And that process is exactly what lawyers do, quite frankly. They're trained to look at stuff from all angles, and that gives them a sort of objective skill in getting to what can be then socially accepted as truth. When they get to part two, all of that debate, which has been bouncing us as readers around from Hythloday's perspective to More's perspective to all those little corners and nooks and crannies in between. When they get finally to part two, we're a little beaten up trying to follow, well, what the hell is he really getting at? We're actually itching for some kind of resolution. And what we get then is part two, which is essentially just a monologue. It is Hythloday going and one by one ticking through the various aspects of this society and describing it. Besides farm work, which, as I said, everybody performs, each person is taught a particular trade of his own, such as wool working, linen making, masonry, metalwork, or carpentry. There is no other craft that is practiced by any considerable number of them. Throughout the island, people wear, and throughout their lives wear, the same style of clothing, except for the distinction between the sexes and between married and unmarried persons. Their clothing is attractive, does not hamper bodily movement, and serves for warm as well as cold weather. What is more, each household makes its own. Interesting. Already, I'm glancing around this room and thinking, how many really want to wear the exact same thing as everybody else and wear that every day for the rest of their lives? That's curious. No other craft. Now, granted, I wouldn't expect there to be a particularly diverse economy in this land for the time, but still, there should be some choices. This is the early modern period. In part one, Moore goes on for some time discussing the problems of sheep herding, sheep farming, the enclosure laws of England, where wealthy landowners started to take over and wall off land that had always been commonly used by small farmers and shepherds. Now they were basically dispossessed of that livelihood. So they all had to pick up and go somewhere where maybe they could find a job. They would move to cities. This is the rise of the middle class. People get off the tenant farm system in massive numbers and start migrating to opportunity. Some of them do well with that. More money in circulation tends to make more money, period. And they start getting social status after that. Every person, and this includes women as well as men, learns a second trade besides agriculture. As the weaker sex, women practice the lighter crafts, such as working in wool or linen. The heavier jobs are assigned to the men. As a rule, a son is trained to his father's craft, for which most feel a natural inclination. But if anyone is attracted to another occupation, he is transferred by adoption into a family practicing the trade he prefers. And I wonder how many today would follow that same path and say, well, my parents did this, so I will do it too. And if you don't want to, well, you're free to change that. You just have to go out and find a different family, one that comports with your professional ambitions. What does it mean to just say, well, Mom, Dad, it's been nice, but I'm just not feeling this wool thing you got going here. I'm going to go down there. They're making furniture. I like working with wood. That's more my thing. So, you know, take care. Bye-bye. The work is meant to be universal. Everybody does it. But it does institute some curbs on it. The thing about capitalism that was seeping into the world here is that it tends to demand more and more of your time and encourage you to sacrifice more and more personal time to the pursuit of money. The chief and almost the only business of the SIFA grants, some of the managers there, is to manage matters so that no one sits around in idleness, and assure that everyone works hard at his trade, but no one has to exhaust himself with endless toil from early morning to late at night, as if he were a beast of burden. Such wretchedness, really worse than slavery, is the common lot of workmen almost everywhere except Utopia. Of the day's 24 hours, the Utopians devote only 6 to work. They work 3 hours before noon. When they go to lunch, after lunch, they rest for a couple hours, then go to work for another 3 hours. Then they have supper, and at 8 o'clock, counting the first hour after noon as 1, they go to bed and sleep for 8 hours. Now, that's pretty regimented. But you got to admit that that 6-hour workday, that sounds pretty cool. That debate goes on today. People will argue for a 6-hour workday. The 8-hour workday has only really been with us for about 100 or so years now. Before that, 18 was not unheard of, even for children. So you can see how he is taking some of what he sees around him, with people working in London for brutal hours, often quite exploited for their labor. Their labor is cheap. And he is trying to adjust that and say, well, no, we don't want to do that. Because those hours were still very new to him, and he is trying to put the brakes on that. It is essentially a very conservative move he's doing here. The other hours of the day, when they are not working, eating, or sleeping, are left to each person's individual discretion, provided that free time is not wasted in roistering or sloth, but used properly in some chosen occupation. I love the freedom that he starts out with there. Everybody's free to do whatever they want with their free time as long as they're not wasting it with something stupid. That's a rule that I make as a dad, and I expect my kids to call me on it at a certain point. Because, let's face it, that's a somewhat tyrannical position to take. It raises the question also of who is to judge what is a waste of time? Who? It seems like the author. And that judgmentalism comes through. We learn progressively that people should spend their free time in quiet study. They should be provided with lectures starting around 6 a.m. every day that they can attend. Now, I love a good lecture. But at 6 a.m., yeah, I'm guessing I'm not alone in that. Other free time is to be spent gardening. Thomas More liked his gardens, so he figured, yeah, that's good for other people too. And just quiet study in general. Well, everybody likes to just sit and read for hours and hours on end. That would make everybody happy. So everybody should do that. That would be good. And if everybody else is just reading quietly to themselves, then Thomas More is free to read quietly to himself and not have everybody bothering him. Yeah, he is a little bit, perhaps, over the top as well in carving out certain exemptions from his universal labor rules. Everybody in society is supposed to do this work, farming or one of the crafts, regardless of any personal inclination. Everybody has to do it, except two groups. Number one, scholars. If you're an intellectual, well, it's just silly for you to go and waste your time doing a lot of manual labor. Why not just spend your time in your library and your personal study and do that? And of course, Thomas More was an intellectual who liked to spend time in the library. So he would be exempt from the labor laws. The other group, government officials, which was the job he was considering taking, giving up some of his peace and quiet in the library. Those two groups are allowed to skip the mandatory work. Consider, too, how little labor their clothing requires. Their work clothes are unpretentious garments made of leather, which last 7 years. When they go out in public, they cover these rough working clothes with a cloak. Throughout the entire island, these cloaks are of the same color, which is that of natural wool. As a result, they not only need less wool than people in other countries, but what they do need is less expensive. Everybody wears the exact same thing. The color of wool, meaning no color at all. Kind of a dull gray, perhaps. Everybody, regardless of what they want. And I like that little touch in there. Well, your work clothes should last you 7 years. How many of you can go 7 years without buying a new little article of clothing? I mean, I'm bad. I have t-shirts from the early 1990s, but I'm not quite that bad. I have some new things. This shirt is not from the 1990s. I'll make that clear. But you see him again and again and again setting up these rather austere conditions. And he puts them right at the beginning. He has a little bit about the geography of the island, and it sort of generally looks like England. But then he's getting into all of this stuff that really hits home because it's about home. It's about the personal life. You could start off in any way describing all the information you want to impart. But here he's starting off with something very, very personal to people. What they wear, how they work, how often they work, what they work at, how they build their lives in general. And it's right up front. And you gotta wonder, well, why would he do that? You know, I was really on board with, all right, you know, this Utopia, it sounds like a cool place. Sell me on it. But now, aside from that 6-hour workday thing, it doesn't sound all that great. It sounds like, quite frankly, a totalitarian police state. Not something a freedom-loving people like the English would generally like. It does have some perks. There's been a lot of press in the last 2 years mentioning this this book because of the mandatory quarantining of people who are sick. Those who have a contagious disease such as might pass from one to another may be isolated. The hospitals are well ordered and supplied with everything needed to cure the patients who are nursed with tender and watchful care. Well, gee, when would we ever want something like that? So suddenly, all right, I'm nudging back up to it again. You're driving me away with all of that, everybody wearing basically a dull gray burlap sack all day, every day for 7 years on end. But now it's like, oh, okay. Good hospitals, a society that cares for its sick, for its elderly. Okay. I'm thinking about it. When he starts getting into the economics, which are always a hot topic, he is advocating essentially a form of communism. No private possessions of any kind. This has a long tradition as an idea going back to Plato, is really the source that he's drawing from. But he makes it sort of funny. He takes gold, which is so valued in this new monetary society. A society like England where capitalism is slowly taking over. People are no longer just doing subsistence farming. They are, farming on a grand scale. They are practicing trades. They are selling and buying and using money instead of just barter system stuff. And he knows also that the connection with the new world that Utopia is supposedly in the middle of, gold is a big motivator. That's what Columbus was looking for. That's certainly what Cortez was looking for. That's what pretty much everybody in the age of exploration, which this is coming out right in the heart of, was sailing, risking their lives, sailing over the Atlantic Ocean to go find. But More takes it and essentially satirizes that. He has the fetters for slaves. Yes, there are slaves in this society. The fetters and chains for slaves made of gold. And when he sees, or when he portrays foreign dignitaries coming over to visit Utopia, they're all dressed as foreign dignitaries always are, very well, very fancy, very ostentatiously, dripping with gold, and the children of Utopia all laugh at them and say, they all look like they're criminals or slaves or something. Gold becomes a joke. It is a very austere world that he is portraying. It has its little bright spots, and he tosses those out from time to time, but always bringing you back to, well, gee, that sounded good. That little bit about the gold was kind of funny. I'm charmed again. I'm leaning back in, but I don't know about all this other stuff. I don't know about this social engineering that is going on here. When he's writing about their philosophy, page 242, he writes about how the law can create outcomes and even things out for people if things go wrong, if they lose something. But what he's really talking about is, from a more modern perspective, a loss of all freedom. A loss of individual rights adjudicated by someone, it's a little uncertain who. They assume that if you train people properly, if you raise them in a good society, they will be good people. It makes sense, right? Raise them well, they'll be fine. You don't have to worry. Good in, process, good out, product. These and the like attitudes the utopians have picked up partly from their upbringing, since the institutions of their commonwealth are completely opposed to such folly, and partly from instruction and their reading of good books. Now, I am not one to denigrate the reading of good books, but I would take issue with the expectation that reading good books automatically makes you a good person, and that you can force this on someone. Now remember, everything in this society is pretty well structured. You don't have a lot of free time. Your free time is what you use to read books. What books? Well, good books. Who says they're good books? Thomas More says they're good books. And presumably, the people running the society would determine what good books are. You're not just going down to the local library or a good used bookstore and thumbing your way through and saying, yeah, what gives me the tingles today? Can you trust what somebody is force-feeding you? They seem overly inclined to the view of those who think that all or most human happiness consists of pleasure. And what is more surprising, they seek support for this comfortable opinion in their religion, which is serious and strict, indeed almost stern and forbidding. For they never discuss happiness without joining to their philosophic rationalism certain principles drawn from religion. Without these religious principles, they think that reason by itself is weak and defective in its efforts to investigate true happiness. Now, the pursuit of pleasure is Epicureanism. It's not necessarily pursuit of pleasure like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but the pursuit of higher pleasures. The pursuit of, well, if I were to drink and take drugs and do all of that stuff, I would wake up the next morning and feel really sick. So that's not pleasure. They seek a more elevated kind of pleasure. But what they also denounce quite vehemently is the idea that there is any sort of an afterlife. And Catholicism, Thomas More was very Catholic, Catholicism has a problem with that. If you don't believe in an afterlife, you're going to burn in hell. Consequently, the utopians maintain that one should not only abide by private agreements, but also obey all those public laws which control the distribution of vital goods, such as are the very substance of pleasure. Any such laws, provided they have been properly promulgated by a good king, or ratified by a people free of force and fraud, should be obeyed. You accept the limitations. You accept the discomforts. You accept whatever suffering you have to. You do it stoically. And I like also properly promulgated by a good king. What makes a king good, and who's to say that what he does is proper? Chances are it's him. Now that little phrase, I got to tell you, sets off a little bell with me because I see properly promulgated, which is fun to say. I highly recommend everybody try and say that out loud in the elevator as you're going home tonight. Properly promulgated. But I can't help but notice that it sounds a little silly. That's what we call alliteration, when you hit those same P's in quick succession like that. Now, I don't know the original Latin. I am perfectly happy admitting that. But I'm thinking maybe the translators here included that for a reason. Because a slightly arch phrase, a slightly out of place word can signal perhaps a little insincerity. A word that sounds a little odd and makes you lean in a little. Promulgated. Properly promulgated. Maybe that's a way of flagging attention to a reader, an astute reader, a reader who is very alert to this kind of stuff, to lean in and say, well, gee, what does that mean? And what does properly promulgated mean? And what does it mean to be a good king? And has there ever really been such a thing? That sense of human freedom is absent from this, and in little ways the pitch is getting more extreme, and perhaps we are meant to reject it, or at least start to feel a little queasy about it. It is the same kind of absurdity to be pleased by empty ceremonial honors. What true and natural pleasure can you get from someone's bent knee or bared head? Will the creaks in your own knees be eased thereby, or the madness in your head, the phantom of false pleasure, is illustrated by others who run mad with delight over their own blue blood, plume themselves on their nobility, and with delight over their and applaud themselves for their own rich ancestors, the only ancestors that count nowadays. Remember, this is a guy who is weighing the possibility of going to work for the King of England. Bending knees is going to be something he'll have to do an awful lot of in that role. So you can see him tossing this out there with a kind of hostility to the idea. This is exactly the problem that he captured in the little drama in Book 1 between Hythloday and the character of More, where Hythloday can't compromise his individual integrity, his sense of morality, for social obligation. Yes, if you are working for the king, you're going to have to bow and scrape an awful lot. You're going to have to be a yes man. You're going to have to go along with a lot of stuff you just can't believe these people are so stupid they're doing. But maybe that allows you to do a little good. By bowing and scraping, you get in the room where it happens. And you can then change things in just little ways, perhaps, but still change them. Pleasures of the body, they also divide into two classes. The first is that which fills the senses with immediate delight. Sometimes this happens when bodily organs have been weakened by natural heat or restored with food or drink. Sometimes it happens when we eliminate some excess from the body, as when we move our bowels, generate children, or relieve an itch. He should write Valentine's Day cards, because he just equated generating children, and we know what that means, to pooping, or just scratching an itch. Is this a flattering view of human physical needs? No. Is this somebody who maybe has an issue or two with human physical needs? Yeah, probably. I would strongly advise, this is just me personally talking, anybody who's out on a first date with somebody who equates human physical intimacy with pooping, I would strongly suggest you excuse yourself, go to the bathroom, and then sneak out the back door. Never call that person again. But it is part and parcel with the image that we have been getting of this character throughout. He doesn't particularly like normal human stuff. His idea of fun is getting up at dawn and attending a good lecture. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last time, but More himself, and again, I don't advise leaning too hard on biography with any writer, but here I think it's just apt. He wore a hair shirt throughout his life. He lived in a monastery after he became a lawyer. So as a free adult working in the world and probably making not bad money, he was living in a monastery. They're cold, they're damp, they're uncomfortable. He's eating terrible food. He is suffering mortification of the flesh. He is literally whipping himself to experience pain and remind himself of how the body is awful and deserves to be whipped so that the spirit can soar above. And his son-in-law, who wrote a biography of him, recounts how one night, when he was a middle-aged guy, they noticed that he was wearing a shirt made of hair, which is meant to be as uncomfortable as that sounds, and it is meant to torture the flesh. This is his relationship to humanity. So it is sometimes ironic when he is spoken of as a humanist, an early and pronounced champion of the tradition of humanism, which is a celebration of all things human. He takes a specific iteration of that. He's more in the Christian humanist realm than some of the Italians, but it is about a celebration of man, independent of celebrations of God. But he doesn't seem to like man very much, or at least what it means to be human. There is a widespread practice of slavery, which he sees as perfectly fine and unobjectionable. This is one way he sees for dealing with what he calls the hardworking, penniless drudges from other nations who voluntarily choose to become slaves in Utopia. That's immigrant labor pool. Just make them slaves. Easy. He talks about suicide and euthanasia. If somebody is really sick, they're not going to get better. Well, sometimes it is the humane thing to do. But again, you get that sense of there's not a lot of sentimentality there. He's not indulging his emotions terribly well. He is rationally concluding that, well, yes, when grandma gets to a certain point, it's just better for all if we kill her. Who's going to hold the pillow over her face? There is that oddity that he's always jostling you with. Probably the weirdest is his discussions of marriage. He gets a lot of chatter from people noting that his advice for a young couple is to examine one another naked. And that before really even dating, they should expose themselves to one another and judge from that. Not touching. Anything premarital would be very illicit, and that's wrong. But you're expected to go in, take a look at the merchandise, lift up the hood. Okay, I'm going to be looking at that for the next 20 years. Sounds good. Let's go for it. A little cold, little anti-romantic. Again, anybody who has this pitched to them on an early date, don't wait for another date. All of these come with a kind of a theme, however. All of these policies, the governmental policies that he dwells on because he's already thinking in the back of his head that, yeah, I think I'm going to work in government. The social engineering policies of how to organize a perfect society because, let's face it, he's a little fussy and judgmental. And everybody would be so much better off if they just did as I told them. But all of these basically boil down to hostility and judgmentalism on 3 counts. There's a critic of his, Hexter, who identified 3 of the so-called 7 deadly sins that really get under the skin of Sir Thomas More. And that is sloth, greed, and pride. And when you read through these little descriptions of life, you see those are the problems he really focuses on. When he's talking about the wealthy, he doesn't talk about the money so much as the laziness that it provides. The sloth. He doesn't mind them having money, he minds them doing nothing and just indulging themselves in it. The money is obviously also part of greed, the acquisition of money. The focus on it comes under repeated attack. Hence, the 6-hour workday. Like, well, people should work enough, but not too much. And underneath even both of those is pride. Pride is, I think we can all say, pretty antithetical to a guy who thinks that the ideal world, or claims that the ideal world would be everybody wearing a similar shade of dull gray. Somebody who obviously has some problems with gold. Somebody who thinks that nobody should have any problem. Just, oh, okay, that person is interested in dating me. All right, have them come over to my place and I'll stand on a box out in the front yard and take off my clothes and he can judge me for it. Not a lot of pride there. The idea that somebody thinks that they're better than they are comes under great, great attack. And again, we're back to the monk aspect of his personality. It is a Christianity of severe humility that he is always preaching. And pride is the enemy of that. So when he is wrapping up his argument towards the end, always look at beginnings and endings, you can see him ticking through these different ideas. Now here I'd like to see anyone try to compare this equity of the utopians with the so-called justice that prevails among other peoples, among whom let me perish if I can discover the slightest scrap of justice or fairness. What kind of justice is it when a nobleman or a goldsmith or a moneylender or someone else who makes his living by doing either nothing at all or something completely useless to the Commonwealth gets to live a life of luxury and grandeur? Greed, sloth, always ignites his rage. And yet when these insatiably greedy and evil men have divided among themselves all the goods which would have sufficed for the entire people, how far they remain from the happiness of the Utopian Republic, which has abolished not only money, but with it greed. What a mass of trouble was cut away by that one step. What a multitude of crimes was pulled up by the roots. Everyone knows that if money were abolished, fraud, theft, robbery, quarrels, brawls, altercations, seditions, murders, treasons, poisons, and a whole set of crimes which are avenged but not prevented by the hangman would at once die out. If money disappeared, so would fear, anxiety, worry, toil, and sleepless nights, even poverty, the one condition which seems more than anything else to need money for its relief would die away if money were entirely abolished. A couple things there. You can abolish money. At this stage in English society, capitalism was taking root, but it probably could have been altered if they really wanted to. So he's making a serious suggestion here. But also, notice right in the middle of that, abolished not only money, but with it greed. You can get rid of money. That's fairly easy. A simple effort by, world governments and banks can render all of the cards in our wallets null and void. You can do that. But would that change greed? Would that really make a difference in the human heart? Remember Cain and Abel. Cain became the first murderer because he just felt resentment for his brother. Those human emotions are much more deeply rooted. And when he gives you this long list, again, so conspicuously, if money were abolished, fraud, theft, robbery, quarrels, brawls, altercations, seditions, murders, treasons, poisonings, and a whole set of crimes which are envisioned but not prevented by the hangman would at once die out. Really? That many? All of them? You can change human beings with monetary policy? He admits this, though. Pride is too deeply fixed in human nature to be easily plucked out, so I am glad that the utopians at least have been lucky enough to achieve this commonwealth, which I wish all mankind would imitate. It's the elements of the pride that seem the most incredible of all of his suggestions. The clothes. The family alliances. The love of one's work. The identification with one's job. And the pride you might feel in doing a job that you're particularly well suited for and not just slotted into because your dad did it. He sets all this up in this long speech right at the very end. As a very well-trained lawyer, Moore would know what a peroration is. It's when you jump up on your soapbox and give a stunning closing argument. And he does that here. But he goes just a little over the top and signals that, well, maybe this Raphael guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Maybe this is all just a pipe dream. When Raphael finished the story, I was left thinking that not a few of the customs and laws he had described as existing among the utopians were quite absurd. So that's a pretty big pushback from the figure of Moore, who had just been sitting there listening to this long monologue. The communal living takes away all the nobility, magnificence, splendor, and majesty which, in the popular view, are the true ornaments and glory of any commonwealth. Well, now there we have another list of characteristics. The nobility, magnificence, splendor, and majesty, which all mean essentially the same thing. So you got to wonder, well, why is he saying all those things that mean the same thing? Because he's calling attention to it so that you can lean in and say, Is that really what makes a nation great? A people great? The nobility, magnificence, splendor, and majesty? Is that really the true ornament? So after this long speech by Hythloday, More, the character of More, comes in and says, I don't know. And he starts to push back at it, but pushes back a little bit too much again, with another long list of things that sound equally ridiculous. So the reader, having been ushered into Book 2, hoping for some sort of resolution to that debate of Book 1, is now right back in that sense of uncertainty. Like, I don't know how to take this. And the significant tip on that is that More himself lets the argument die. But I saw that Raphael was tired with talking, and I was not sure he would take contradiction with these matters. So he doesn't push back. He does not answer the argument. He just lets it stand. Now, you can look at that a couple of different ways. Number one, he concedes the whole argument if he doesn't push it back. This is the lawyer talking. Hythloday has entered all of this into the record, and anybody coming to it would be able to say that, oh, well, obviously, communism is good and that's the way to go. But he does push back, ever so slightly, just not convincingly enough to carry us along with it. So we are left, as readers, in that position of not really knowing what to believe. Because we have had this long, exhaustive case laid out before us for totalitarianism. But we're not there. We feel our own hesitation. The character of More gives us a little nudge in that direction, but just enough to dislodge us, not enough to convince us of anything real. And in doing that, at that point, in these last few lines, we achieve what is the whole purpose of the Renaissance. And that is critical perspective. That is an independent point of view. We don't know anything. We don't know what is right, what is wrong. We don't know if any of these are really good. Some of it sounds good, some of it I'm not sure, but we know that we have doubts about it. We know we have some things that sound good, but our position is independent. And independence is what he wants to begin with. He's having a hard time deciding whether or not to give up his independence and go work for the king, and he writes this as a declaration of that. It's not an obvious thing, but these are the forces at play in his mind right now. And by doing that, he is giving us a model for how he sees the proper role for humanity. Independent, critical, not taking everything, not falling for every plan that comes along, because some of those plans might sound kind of good in some aspects, but then you look a little closer and they're really just nightmare visions. The fact that he leaves it unanswered when he is, again, down to the DNA, a lawyer, and he leaves the case ambiguous at the end. That is the signal That ambiguity is what we all have to get used to. Because that's where humanity was in the Renaissance. All the certainties were pulled up from under us. All those people who got pushed off their land that their family had been farming for hundreds of years until this one rich guy up in the big house said, no, that's my land, you can't have that. Everything that they knew was gone, upended, and they had to go from the nice quaint little English countryside where everybody has their own sheep to London, which is very, very, very different. This is a world where the certainties of astronomy had been revolutionized. We were no longer at the center of the universe. We're just one planet among many spinning around in no particular order, it seems. We're going around the sun. The sun's not going around us. At the same time, and I started with this the other day, the certainties of religion themselves, the Christian faith, were under unprecedented attack. At first just by the one German monk, Martin Luther, but then more and more and more. Undermining the belief system that meant so much to so many. Everything these people knew was untethered. And they were scrambling to make sense of it. And More's suggestion in this is to say, well, that's kind of the way it is. Know what you believe, know who you are. Like what you do, but know deep down that all of the extraneous parts of your life are a little volatile. They can fly away. And they did for him, of course. He was in the center of power for many, many years, and then suddenly his head was cut off and planted on a pike outside the Tower of London. Left up there for quite a while, too. Let the birds have a chow down. But he chose a set of beliefs to ground himself on. He died for them. He died for his religious beliefs, his sense of doctrine, more than faith. And that was the unreducible for him. Everything else he understood can float away. But he kept what was special to him very close indeed. Though he is a man of unquestionable learning, highly experienced in the ways of the world, I cannot agree with everything he said. Yet I freely confess there are many things in the utopian commonwealth that in our own societies I would wish rather than expect to see. It's the conflict between hope and reason, between our spirit, our aspiration, and our worldly limitations. We can try for them, but by nature, some things are unattainable.